The classroom at the Galactic Academy held students from 40 different worlds. Each one representing the best and brightest their species could offer. Jake Morrison sat in the back row, his notebook open in front of him as he listened to Professor Dralix explain the properties of dark matter around him. Other students showed off their natural abilities without even trying. Vera, a Centauri with 4 arms covered in blue scales, took notes on multiple tablets simultaneously while also solving equations on a separate screen. Krelvin, a massive Thronic whose species evolved on a world with 3 times standard gravity, barely fit in his reinforced seat as his muscles bulged under his thick hide. The other students came from worlds that gave them advantages. Humans simply did not have. Some could see in spectrums of light, invisible to human eyes. Others possessed telepathic abilities that let them share thoughts instantly. A few breathed atmospheres that would kill most species within minutes. Jake just wrote in his notebook with a simple pen, his movements quiet and unremarkable. When Professor Dralix asked questions, dozens of hands, tentacles, and appendages shot into the air. Jake rarely raised his hand, and when he did speak, his answers were short and practical. His classmates had long ago decided that the human was probably the weakest student in their class. Earth had only joined the galactic community 20 years ago, and most species still knew very little about humanity. The general assumption was that humans were a friendly but fragile species who excelled at diplomacy but lacked the physical and mental advantages of older civilizations. Grun had once commented loudly that humans seemed soft with their thin skin and average strength. Vera had agreed, noting that humans required very specific environmental conditions to survive and lacked any remarkable sensory abilities. Jake had heard these comments but never responded to them. He simply continued taking his notes, studying his lessons, and keeping to himself. The truth was that Jake found the academy challenging, but not because the material was too difficult. Struggled more with the social dynamics and the constant need to prove himself worthy of being there. Back home on Earth, he had been the same way, quiet, observant, and often underestimated. His mother always said he was a thinker, someone who processed the world internally before acting. That trait served him well in academics, but made him nearly invisible in a classroom full of beings who naturally commanded attention. On this particular day, Professor Dralix made an announcement that changed everything. Students, I have important news about your final evaluation for this term. The classroom fell silent, and even the telepathic species stopped their mental chatter every decade. The Galactic Academy administers the Deathworld survival test. Excited murmurs rippled through the room. The Deathworld test was legendary, a challenge that separated the truly elite students from those who merely excelled in controlled environments. Each of you will be assigned to a Class 10 Deathworld, planets that are considered among the most hostile environments in known space. Professor Dralix's S4 eyes swept across the classroom. You will be given minimal equipment and must survive for 7 standard days. She pulled up a holographic display showing various nightmare worlds. One planet featured acid rain that could dissolve flesh in seconds. Another showed creatures the size of buildings hunting across volcanic plains. A third displayed forests where every plant contained deadly toxins. The test has a 30% failure rate, the professor continued. However, we have safety measures in place. If your vital signs reach critical levels, an emergency beacon will automatically activate and you will be rescued. Krelvin grinned, his sharp teeth visible. Finally, a test worthy of our abilities. Vera's forearms gestured confidently. This will be an excellent opportunity to demonstrate proper survival techniques. Other students nodded and spoke eagerly about their species. Evolutionary advantages, those from high gravity. Worlds discussed their superior strength, those from toxic atmosphere planets mentioned their resistant biology, those with enhanced senses talked about their ability to detect danger. Before it arrived, Jake continued taking notes, writing down details about each potential test world. He drew small sketches of the terrain features and made lists of the documented hazards. Skrelvin noticed Jake's quiet note-taking and laughed. The human is making drawings. Perhaps he thinks art will save him from a death world. Several other students joined in the laughter. Vera, though not unkind, shook her heads in a gesture of pity. Jake, you should consider requesting an exemption. Humans are not built for such extreme environments. Jake looked up from his notebook, his expression calm. I appreciate your concern, but I will take the test with everyone else. His voice was quiet but firm, and something in his tone made Vera pause, but the moment passed, and the conversation moved on as other students continued boasting about their preparations. Professor Dralix distributed information packets about the test. Each packet contained details on possible planets, environmental hazards, and the standard survival kit they would receive. Jake read through his packet carefully, noting that the survival kit was remarkably basic. A knife, water purifier, fire starter, emergency beacon, and basic medical supplies. Nothing in the kit was specialized or technologically advanced. It was designed to work in any environment and required knowledge and skill to use effectively. The other students barely glanced at their kits, confident that their natural abilities would compensate for any lack of equipment. As the class ended and students filed out, Jake remained in his seat, studying the planetary data. Professor Dralix noticed him and approached. Jake, several students have expressed concern that this test may be too dangerous for humans. Jake closed his notebook and looked at the professor. What is the environmental classification for Earth? The professor's antennae twitched in what might have been confusion. I am not certain. Let me check the database. She pulled up a holographic display and entered the query. Her antennae went rigid as the information appeared. It says Earth is classified as... That cannot be correct. What does it say? Jake asked quietly. It lists Earth as a Class 12 death world. But that classification is reserved for planets that are barely capable of supporting life. Jake stood and picked up his notebook. The classification is correct. Professor, I will see you at the test. He walked out of the classroom, leaving Professor Dralix staring at the holographic display. She read through Earth's environmental data with growing disbelief. Extreme temperature variations, violent weather systems, thousands of predatory species, toxic plants and animals, high oxygen atmosphere that accelerated fire, strong gravity compared to most habitable worlds, and a history of mass extinction events. The quiet human in the back of her class came from a world more dangerous than any planet they would use for testing. Professor Dralix made a mental note to research humanity more thoroughly, but the thought slipped away as other students demanded her attention with questions about the test. Meanwhile, Jake walked through the academy's corridors toward his dormitory. He passed groups of alien students discussing their training regimens and survival strategies. None of them paid him any attention. He was just the quiet one, the human who barely spoke and would probably be the first to activate his emergency beacon. Jake did not mind their dismissal. He had spent his entire childhood camping in Earth's wilderness with his father, learning to survive in deserts, forests, mountains, and swamps. He had faced bears, snakes, extreme weather, and the constant challenge of a world that did not care whether humans lived or died. As he entered his room and set down his notebook, Jake allowed himself a small smile. The Galactic Academy was about to learn something important about humanity. They We're about to learn that when you evolve on a world trying to kill you every single day, a Class 10 Deathworld feels like a camping trip. Test day arrived 3 weeks after the announcement, and the Academy's main hangar, filled with students and transport ships, Jake stood in line with his assigned group. Wearing the standard Academy jumpsuit and carrying only the regulation survival kit around him, other students made last-minute preparations. Some performed elaborate rituals from their homeworlds. Others engaged in final strategy sessions with classmates from the same species. Kelvin performed stretching exercises that would have torn human muscles apart, his body preparing for whatever physical challenges awaited. Vera ran through mental calculations on her multiple tablets, creating probability matrices for different survival scenarios. Professor Dralix stood at the front of the hangar with other instructors, holding a datapad that contained all the test assignments. When I call your name, please proceed to your designated transport, she announced. One by one, students learned their destinations. Vara received Cauldrus 9, a desert world where acidic dust storms could strip flesh from bone. Her 4 arms gestured in acknowledgement, and she walked confidently toward her transport. Kelvin was assigned to Frost 3, a frozen tundra planet with atmosphere so thin that most species would suffocate within hours. He roared in approval, eager to prove his species' superiority. Other students received their assignments with varying reactions. Some appeared confident, others showed visible nervousness, and a few activated translation protocols to hear more details about their assigned worlds. Then Professor Dralix called Jake's name. Jake Morrison, you are assigned to Kessler 7. Ah. Collective gasp went through the assembled students. Even the instructors exchanged concerned glances. Kessler 7 was legendary among Deathworld classifications. The planet featured dense jungles filled with predators that hunted in packs. Plants released toxic spores that caused hallucinations and respiratory failure in most species. The weather changed without warning, bringing storms that could flood entire regions in minutes. Temperature swings of 40 degrees between day and night made climate management nearly impossible. The terrain shifted between deep swamps and tangled forests where visibility dropped to mere meters. Most concerning of all, Kessler 7 had never produced a perfect test score. Every student who survived the planet did so barely, and many required emergency rescue. Vera's scaled face showed genuine concern. Professor, surely there has been a mistake. Kessler 7 is considered the most difficult test environment. Kelvin, despite his earlier mockery, nodded in agreement. Even my people would find that world challenging. Perhaps the humans should receive a different assignment. Jake stepped forward before Professor Dralix could respond. I accept the assignment. His voice carried no hesitation. No fear, just quiet certainty. Professor Dralix looked at him for a long moment. Jake, I want you to understand that there is no shame in requesting a transfer to a less hostile world. I understand, Professor, but I am ready. Something in Jake's calm demeanor made the professor nod. Very well. Proceed to Transport 7. Jake walked toward his assigned ship, while other students whispered behind him. Most assumed he was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. Few thought he simply did not understand the danger he faced. The transport to Kessler 7 was a small ship designed for single student deployments. The crew consisted of 3 aliens, a pilot, a systems operator, and a medical technician. They greeted Jake with sympathetic expressions. The pilot, a short being with purple skin and large eyes, reviewed the flight plan. We will reach Kessler 7 in approximately 3 hours. The drop zone has been selected based on relatively stable terrain. The systems operator, who resembled a floating jellyfish, added information. Your vital signs will be monitored constantly. If they reach critical thresholds, the emergency beacon activates automatically. The medical technician, an insectoid creature with gentle mannerisms, approached Jake. I want you to know that requesting rescue is not failure. Kessler 7 has humbled many experienced survivors. Jake thanked them for their concern and took a seat in the passenger area. He pulled out his notebook and reviewed the information he had gathered about Kessler 7. The planet had Earth-similar gravity, which was already an advantage. The oxygen content was actually lower than Earth's, meaning the atmosphere was less likely to support rapid fires. The temperature range, while extreme by galactic standards, fell well within conditions Jake had experienced on Earth's deserts could swing 60 degrees between day and night. The predators of Kessler 7 were dangerous, but Earth had produced predators just as deadly. Humans had evolved alongside creatures that viewed them as prey. The jungles were thick and difficult to navigate, but Earth's rainforests were equally challenging. The toxic plants were concerning, but Jake knew that careful observation and testing could identify safe species. He had spent summers with his father learning wilderness survival in various Earth environments. His father had been a survival instructor for the military, and he had taught Jake from a young age. Together, they had camped in the Amazon, the Australian outback, the Alaskan wilderness, and the African savanna. His father's lessons had been simple: observe, adapt, and respect the environment. Never assume you are the dominant force in nature. Always have backup plans for your backup plans. Learn to read the signs that every ecosystem provides. As the transport ship flew through space toward Kessler 7, Jake felt a strange sense of calm. He was not fearless. Fear was a useful tool that kept humans alive in dangerous situations, but he was confident in his preparation and training. The crew members checked on him periodically, clearly worried about the quiet. Human, are you sure you do not want any additional equipment? The pilot asked. We can authorize certain specialty items for extreme assignments. Jake shook his head. The standard kit is sufficient. The systems operator's floating form pulsed with what might have been confusion. Most students request additional supplies. Are you certain you have everything you need? I am certain. Thank you. The medical technician leaned closer. Can I ask you something? You seem very calm for someone about to drop onto one of the galaxy's most hostile planets. Jake looked up from his notebook. My father taught me that panic is more dangerous than any predator. Staying calm lets you think clearly and make good decisions. The three crew members exchanged glances, but said nothing more as Kessler 7 appeared in the view screen. The planet looked exactly as described. Thick green jungles covered most of the visible surface, broken only by winding rivers and occasional clearings. Storm systems moved across the surface like living things, bringing rain and lightning. The atmosphere appeared hazy with moisture and possibly spores. The pilot began the descent sequence. We are approaching the drop zone. Prepare for pod launch. Jake secured his survival kit and entered the drop pod. Small capsule would protect him during atmospheric entry and rough landing as the pod door sealed. The medical technician's voice came through the speaker. Good luck, Jake. Please be safe. Thank you. I will see you in 7 days. The pod launched, and Jake felt the familiar sensation of freefall through the small window. He watched as Kessler 7 grew larger. The transport ship disappeared behind him as the pod entered the atmosphere. Heat shields glowed red as friction built up. The pod shook violently, but Jake kept his breathing steady. He had done skydiving on Earth and remembered his instructors' advice. Trust your equipment and stay calm. The pod's computer announced altitude markers in a neutral voice: 10,000 meters, 5,000 meters, 1,000 meters. Retro rockets fired. Slowing the descent, trees rushed up to meet him. The pod crashed through the jungle canopy, breaking branches as it fell. Finally, it hit the ground with a heavy thud that rattled Jake's teeth. Silence followed. broken only by the sounds of alien wildlife. Jake took a deep breath, checked himself for injuries, and found none. He activated the pod's release mechanism, and the door hissed open. Warm, humid air rushed in, carrying scents both familiar and strange. Jake grabbed his survival kit and stepped out onto Kessler 7. The jungle surrounded him, dense and alive with movement. Strange calls echoed through the trees. Something large moved in the undergrowth nearby. The air felt thick enough to drink. Most species would have activated their emergency beacon within the first hour. Jake Morrison just smiled, looked around at the jungle that reminded him of Earth, and began to work. The Deathworld test had begun. Day 4 began with an emergency alert that sent the monitoring center into chaos. A massive storm system had formed over Kessler 7, something the Academy's meteorologists had not predicted. The storm covered half the planet's surface and was moving directly toward Jake's location. Wind speeds were already reaching dangerous levels. Lightning struck the jungle canopy every few seconds. Temperature was dropping at an alarming rate. "We need to evacuate all students on Kessler 7 immediately," one instructor shouted. Professor Dralix checked the display. "Jake is the only student currently on that planet. The other 2 assigned there were rescued yesterday. Then we evacuate him now, before the storm makes rescue impossible." Professor Dralix watched Jake's vital signs. His heart rate was elevated, but not critically so. His movement patterns showed purposeful activity rather than panic. "Wait. Let us see what he does on the environmental sensors." They watched Jake respond to the approaching storm. He had already noticed the changing weather patterns, the shift in wind direction, the darkening sky, the sudden silence of wildlife. Jake moved quickly, but not frantically. He reinforced his shelter with additional support beams made from strong branches. He used vines to tie everything together, creating redundant attachment points. He dug drainage channels around the shelter to divert water. He gathered extra firewood and stored it in the driest part of his shelter, wrapped in large leaves to keep it protected. He filled every container he had with water. Knowing the storm might contaminate his usual sources, he secured all his supplies, placing them in elevated positions where flooding could not reach them. He is preparing as if he knew the storm was coming, an instructor observed. Professor Dralix nodded. Humans evolved on a planet with violent and unpredictable weather. Reading environmental signs is instinctive for them. The storm hit with devastating force. Wind speeds exceeded 100 kilometers per hour. Rain fell so heavily that visibility dropped to nearly zero. Lightning turned the jungle into a strobe-lit nightmare flash. Floods swept through low-lying areas. The temperature plummeted by 30 degrees in less than an hour. Most species would have died within minutes of exposure to such conditions. The monitoring team watched Jake's shelter anxiously. Structure bent and swayed in the wind, but held water rushed past on all sides. But the elevated position and drainage channels kept the interior relatively dry. Jake had built a fire pit with stones arranged to protect the flames from wind and rain. He maintained a small fire using a technique that involved partially burned wood and careful management of airflow. The fire produced enough heat to keep him warm without creating smoke that might suffocate him in the enclosed space. "This is impossible," one instructor whispered. "No student has ever maintained fire in conditions like these." Professor Dralix was no longer watching just Jake's display. She had pulled up Earth's environmental database and was reading with growing astonishment. Earth's weather patterns made Kessler 7 storm look almost gentle by comparison. Hurricanes that devastated coastlines, tornadoes that could level entire towns, blizzards that buried landscapes under meters of snow, droughts that lasted years, floods that reshaped continents. Humans did not just survive Earth's weather, Professor Dralix said softly. They thrived in every climate zone on the planet. From frozen tundras to burning deserts, from tropical rainforests to arid grasslands. She pulled up more information. their antennae quivering with each new discovery. Humans had no natural fur or scales for protection. They had no ability to hibernate through harsh seasons. They lacked the physical power to fight off most large predators, yet they had spread across their entire planet. Adapting to conditions that would kill most species, they accomplished this through intelligence, tool use, and a remarkable ability to learn and adapt. As Professor Dralix read, she began to understand what made humans special. They were not the strongest or the fastest. They did not have the best senses or the most efficient biology. What they had was adaptability. Humans could learn to survive anywhere because their homeworld had forced them to develop universal survival principles. A human who learned to survive in a desert could apply those lessons to a tundra. A human who mastered jungle survival could adapt those skills to mountains. They were generalists in a galaxy of specialists. Storm raged for 18 hours. During that time, 70 students across all test planets activated their emergency beacons. The storm on Kessler 7 was only one of several extreme weather events affecting multiple worlds. Skrovan finally gave up on Frost 3 when his emergency supplies ran out. He was rescued on day 4. His pride wounded, but his body intact. Of the original 200 students, only 93 remained in the field. Many of those were barely hanging on. Counting the hours until the 7-day test period ended, Jake Morrison spent the storm hours maintaining his fire, monitoring his shelter's integrity, and staying dry. He used the time to organize his supplies, repair his clothing, and plan his activities for the remaining days. When the storm finally passed, Jake emerged to find his camp largely intact. Some of his trail markers had been washed away. Several trees had fallen nearby. The landscape looked different, with new streams and altered terrain, but his shelter stood. His supplies were secure, and he was unharmed. The monitoring team watched as Jake assessed the damage and began making repairs. His stress levels are actually lower than they were before the storm, the systems operator reported. How is that possible? Professor Dralix had been researching human psychology. Humans often feel relief after successfully handling a crisis. The storm was a test of his skills, and he passed. Now he has confidence that he can handle whatever else Kessler 7 might present. She called an emergency faculty meeting. Every instructor involved in the Deathworld test gathered in the conference room. Professor Dralix displayed Jake's performance data alongside Earth's environmental classification. Colleagues, we need to discuss a serious oversight in our understanding of humanity. She pulled up the holographic display showing Earth. We have been treating humans as if they were a fragile species that required gentle handling. We assumed their lack of obvious physical advantages meant they were weak. We were wrong. She showed images of Earth's most hostile environments. Humans evolved on a Class 12 Deathworld, one of the most hostile planets that has produced sentient life. They survived 5 mass extinction events. They competed with and outlasted species larger, faster, and stronger than themselves. They developed tool use, complex language, and social cooperation as survival mechanisms. The faculty members watched in stunned silence as Professor Dralix presented example after example. Humans crossing frozen continents with minimal protection. Humans surviving in deserts where water was scarce. Humans climbing mountains where oxygen was thin. Humans diving deep into oceans. Humans exploring every extreme environment their planet offered. The Deathworld test was designed to challenge students by placing them in environments more hostile than their homeworlds. Professor Dralix let that statement hang in the air. For Jake Morrison, Kessler 7 is not more hostile than Earth. It is simply different. The extreme weather, the dangerous predators, the toxic plants, all of these are challenges he has been trained to handle since childhood. One instructor raised a tentacle. Are you suggesting we made the test too easy for the human? I am suggesting that we fundamentally misunderstood what we were testing. Professor Dralix changed the display to show comparative data. Every other species in this academy evolved on worlds that were stable and relatively safe. They developed specialized adaptations for their specific environments. Humans develop general adaptations that work anywhere. They are not the best at any single thing, but they are competent at everything. She showed Jake's vital signs over the past 4 days. Look at his performance. He's not just surviving, he is comfortable. While other students fight against their environments, Jake is working with his. He understands that survival is not about domination, but about adaptation. The faculty members began to murmur. Among themselves, some were impressed. Others were concerned, and a few were recalculating their assumptions about human capabilities. Professor Dralix raised her voice to regain their attention. We have 3 more days of testing. I want all faculty to observe Jake Morrison's techniques. We may need to revise our understanding of human abilities and adjust our curriculum accordingly. This species joined the galactic community only 20 years ago, and we have barely scratched the surface of what they can do. As the meeting ended, Professor Dralix returned to the monitoring center on the display. Jake was exploring the post-storm landscape. He was documenting new plant species, collecting useful materials, and even seemed to be enjoying himself. The quiet one from the back of the class had become the most remarkable student in the Academy's history, and he still had 3 days to prove just how exceptional humans could be. Back at the Galactic Academy, Professor Dralix sat in the monitoring center with 3 other instructors. Dozens of holographic displays showed vital signs and locations for every student taking the Deathworld test. Each display provided heart rate, body temperature, stress hormones, and geographical position. The monitoring team could also access environmental sensors that tracked local conditions around each student. Varus already showing elevated stress markers. One instructor noted on the display, Vera's vital signs indicated increasing heat, exhaustion despite her species' resistance to harsh conditions. The desert world of Cauldres 9 was proving more challenging than she had anticipated. Another screen showed Krulvan struggling on Frost 3. His breathing was labored, and his body temperature was dropping despite his thick hide. The thin atmosphere was forcing him to work harder for every breath. 17 students have already activated their emergency beacons. The systems operator announced. That is higher than usual for the first day. Professor Dralix cycled through various displays, checking on students from different species. Most showed signs of significant stress. Heart rates were elevated. Stress hormones were flooding their systems, and movement patterns indicated panic or confusion. Then she pulled up Jake Morrison's display and froze. This cannot be correct. Run a diagnostic on his monitoring equipment. The systems operator complied, running checks on Jake's vital sensors. All equipment is functioning properly. Professor Dralix stared at the readings. Jake's heart rate was lower than it had been in the classroom. His stress hormones were barely elevated. His body temperature was stable despite Kessler 7's extreme conditions. Perhaps he is hiding in his pod, too frightened to emerge, another instructor suggested. The systems operator shook his head. Negative. His location tracker shows he has moved approximately 2 kilometers from his landing site. Professor Dralix activated the environmental sensor feed. The display showed Jake moving through the jungle with surprising confidence. He was examining plants, testing soil, and marking trees with his knife to create trail markers. As they watched, Jake stopped beside a plant with large, waxy leaves. He carefully broke off a piece and rubbed it on a small patch of skin on his arm. After waiting several minutes and seeing no reaction, he nodded and collected several leaves, placing them in his kit. What is he doing? One instructor asked. Professor Dralix accessed Earth Survival Techniques database. He is testing plants for toxicity. It is a method humans developed to identify safe resources in unknown environments. Within the first 3 hours on Kessler 7, Jake accomplished more than most students managed in 2 days. He found a water source. Testing it carefully before using his purifier, he identified several edible plants using the same careful testing method. He located a defensible position on high ground near the water, but far enough away to avoid predators that came to drink by nightfall. Jake had constructed a shelter using branches, leaves, and vines. The structure was elevated off the ground to avoid flooding and ground-dwelling predators. It had a sloped roof to shed rain and was positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks. The monitoring team watched in fascination. As Jake worked, his movements were efficient and purposeful. He never rushed, never showed signs of panic, and constantly observed his surroundings. When dangerous-looking insects appeared, he simply moved to a different area rather than attempting to fight or flee. As night fell on Kessler 7, the temperature dropped rapidly. Most students were huddling in their emergency thermal blankets, trying to conserve body heat. Jake built a fire using his fire starter and carefully selected wood. He fed the fire slowly, keeping it small but steady. The flames provided warmth without creating enough light to attract large predators. His technique is remarkable, Professor Dralix admitted. He shows more skill than students who have trained specifically for survival situations. The second day brought new challenges. A pack of predators appeared near Jake's shelter. Creatures that resembled wolves, but with 6 legs and armored heads. The monitoring team prepared to activate Jake's emergency beacon. The predators circled his camp. Clearly interested in this new potential meal, Jake remained in his shelter. Perfectly still, he had already secured his food supplies in a bag hung high in a tree, eliminating food smells that might attract predators. The creatures sniffed around the camp, but found nothing to hold their interest. After 20 minutes, they moved on to hunt easier prey. How did he know to do that? An instructor asked. Professor Dralix was reading through human survival literature. Humans evolved on a world with apex predators. They learned to make themselves uninteresting rather than trying to fight creatures stronger than themselves. By the 3rd day, Jake had established a routine that seemed almost comfortable. He woke before dawn, added wood to his fire, and boiled water for drinking. He spent the morning foraging for food and improving his shelter. In the afternoon, he explored the surrounding area, always marking his trail and never venturing so far that he could not return before dark. He even started creating backup shelters in different locations, giving himself options if his primary camp became compromised. Monitoring team compared Jake's performance to other students. Of the 200 students taking the test, 40 had already been rescued. Another 60 were barely surviving, using their emergency rations and staying as still as possible to conserve energy. Only a handful seemed to be actively engaging with their environments, and none with Jake's level of confidence. Vera had been rescued on day 2 after severe heat exhaustion caused her to collapse. Deathworld was still on Frost 3 but was burning through his supplies at an alarming rate. His aggressive approach to survival, trying to dominate his environment through force, was exhausting him. The human is not just surviving, Professor Dralix said quietly. He's adapting. There is a significant difference. On the 3rd evening, something happened that made the entire monitoring team gather around Jake's display. Jake encountered his first major predator, a massive creature that resembled a bear crossed with a reptile. The beast was easily 400 pounds of muscle, claws and teeth. It stood between Jake and his camp, blocking his return path. Every instructor in the monitoring center tensed. This was the moment they had feared. The creature was too large to outrun and too powerful to fight. The emergency beacon should activate automatically if Jake's vital signs spiked, but Jake's heart rate barely increased. He stopped walking and slowly lowered himself into a slight crouch. He avoided direct eye contact with the predator. He made himself appear larger by slowly raising his arms. Then he backed away at an angle, moving neither toward nor away from the creature. He made low, steady sounds that carried no fear or aggression. The predator watched him for several long seconds. Then, inexplicably, it lost interest. Massive creature turned and walked away into the jungle. The monitoring center erupted in shocked exclamations. That should not have worked. One instructor said, "The creature is not even from Earth. How did the human know it would respond to those behaviors, Professor?" Dralix was rapidly reading through files on human evolution. Humans lived alongside predators for millions of years. They learned to read body language and behavior patterns that transcend specific species. She pulled up more information about Earth's wildlife on Earth. Humans developed techniques that worked on creatures as diverse as bears, big cats, wolves, and crocodiles. They learned universal principles of predator behavior. Another instructor pointed at the display. "Look at his vital signs. He's calmer now than before the encounter." It was true. Jake's heart rate had already returned to its resting level. His stress hormones showed only a minor spike as he reached his camp. He checked his perimeter, added wood to his fire, and prepared a meal from foraged plants and preserved rations. The monitoring team watched in silence. The quiet human who had seemed so unremarkable in the classroom was demonstrating skills that defied their expectations. Professor Dralix made a decision. "I want every member of the faculty to review Earth's classification and human evolutionary history. We have severely underestimated this species." As day 3 ended, Jake sat by his fire, looking up at Kessler 7's unfamiliar stars. He thought about his father, who had taught him that nature was not an enemy to be conquered, but a system to be understood and respected. His classmates had laughed at his quiet nature and careful note-taking. Thea had assumed his silence meant weakness, but Jake knew something they were only beginning to learn. The deadliest predator is not the one that roars the loudest. It is the one that watches, learns, and adapts. Days 5 and 6 passed without incident, and the monitoring center watched Jake Morrison with growing amazement. Had stopped merely surviving and had begun to thrive on Kessler 7. His daily routine showed confidence and efficiency that surpassed even the most optimistic predictions. Each morning, he maintained his fire and prepared a meal that combined his rations with foraged plants. He had identified 17 edible plant species and had learned which parts of each were safest to consume. His shelter had evolved into a comfortable camp with separate areas for sleeping, food storage, and tool maintenance. He created backup shelters in 3 different locations, giving himself options if his primary camp became compromised. His water purification system now included multiple methods: boiling, filtering, and using water-storing plants he had discovered. On day 5, Jake began mapping the surrounding area in greater detail. He climbed trees to get better vantage points. Sketching terrain features in his notebook, he marked locations of water sources, dangerous areas, and useful resources. He even documented the local wildlife, noting their behaviors and movement patterns. The monitoring team watched as he approached a small alien creature caught in thorny vines. The creature resembled something between a squirrel and a bird. With fur and small wings, it was struggling against the vines, injuring itself further with each movement. Jake approached slowly, speaking in soft, calm tones. The creature initially panicked, but Jake's gentle manner seemed to soothe it. Carefully cut away the vines using his knife, working slowly to avoid hurting the animal. Once free, the creature stayed on his hand for a moment, as if understanding it had been helped. Then it chirped once and flew away into the canopy. Did that just happen? An instructor asked in disbelief. Professor Dralix was reading yet another file on human behavior. Humans form emotional connections with other species easily. They kept animals as companions on Earth for thousands of years. Even in a survival situation, they show compassion for other living things. Another instructor shook his head. Most species would have eaten that creature or ignored it. The human helped it for no practical reason. Exactly, Professor Dralix said. That is what makes humans different. They do not see everything through the lens of immediate survival. They have something called empathy that extends even to species they have never encountered before. By day 6, Jake had created what could only be described as a functional wilderness homestead. His camp was clean, organized, and efficient. He had tools he had crafted from materials around him. He had dried plants for emergency food. He had multiple fire-starting methods beyond his original equipment. He had even improved some of his original shelter designs, making them more weather-resistant. The monitoring team compared his performance to historical records. No student in the 70-year history of the Deathworld test demonstrated such complete mastery of their environment. Most students spent the entire 7 days in survival mode, barely holding on until rescue Jake looked like he could stay for 7 months without difficulty. On the morning of day 7, the extraction team prepared to retrieve Jake from Kessler 7. The team consisted of the same crew that had dropped him off: the pilot, systems operator, and medical technician. They reviewed Jake's vital signs and performance data during the flight. I cannot believe these readings are accurate, the pilot said. His stress levels are lower than they were on the transport ship. The medical technician studied the data. He actually gained weight during the test. Most students lose significant body mass. How is that possible? The systems operator pulled up Jake's nutritional data. He was supplementing his rations with local food sources. His caloric intake was higher than standard survival rations alone would provide. As they approached Kessler 7, the crew prepared for various scenarios. Sometimes students were so traumatized they needed immediate medical attention. Sometimes they were unconscious from exhaustion. Sometimes they refused to leave, too disoriented to recognize the extraction team. The pilot landed near Jake's camp and opened the hatch. The crew stepped out cautiously, unsure what they would find. Jake Morrison sat beside a well-maintained fire, cooking something that actually smelled appealing. His camp looked like a professional survival instructor had set it up. Everything was organized, clean, and functional. Jake looked up as the crew approached and smiled. "Hello. Is it day 7 already?" The medical technician approached carefully. "Jake, are you feeling well? Do you need medical attention?" "I feel fine, thank you. Would you like something to eat? I managed to make a decent stew from local plants." The 3 crew members stared at him. The pilot finally found his voice. "You are offering us food." Jake nodded. "I have plenty." It seemed wasteful not to share. The systems operator's floating form pulsed rapidly. Most students are barely conscious by extraction time. "You appear refreshed." Jake stood and began packing his supplies. Kessler 7 is challenging, but once you understand the environment, it provides everything you need. As Jake gave them a tour of his camp, showing them his various shelters and explaining his techniques, the crew realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This was not just success. It was mastery. The flight back to the academy was unlike any extraction the crew had ever performed. Usually, they spent the trip monitoring recovering students instead. They spent it asking Jake questions about his techniques. He explained his methods with patience and clarity. He showed them his sketches of local flora and fauna. He demonstrated the tools he had crafted. By the time they reached the academy, the crew was convinced they had just transported the most remarkable student in the test's history. The landing bay was crowded with students, Faculty and administrators, everyone wanted to see the results announced of the original 200 students. Only 58 had completed the full 7 days without rescue. Many of those had barely survived. The rescued students stood to the side, their faces showing the trauma of their experience. Skrellin was there, his usual pride replaced with humility. Vera watched the proceedings with her 4 arms crossed. Curious about the results, Professor Dralix stood at the podium, holding the final evaluation reports. Students, faculty, and honored guests, we have completed the evaluation of this year's Deathworld test. This test challenged you in ways that standard academic assessments cannot. Survival is not just about knowledge. It is about application, adaptation, and mental fortitude. She began reading score. Students who completed the test received passing grades, ranging from 60 to 85%. Those who were rescued received incomplete marks but would have opportunities to retake the test. And Professor Dralix paused. We have one evaluation remaining. Jake Morrison, please step forward. Jake walked to the front, and the crowd murmured. Most expected him to have failed or barely passed. Professor Dralix looked at Jake with an expression that might have been respect. Jake Morrison, you have achieved something unprecedented in the 70-year history of this test. You are the first student to receive a perfect score on the Deathworld test. The crowd erupted in shocked exclamations. Perfect score was theoretically possible, but had never been achieved. Your performance exceeded every evaluation criterion. Professor Dralix continued. You demonstrated advanced survival skills, environmental adaptation, resource management, and emotional stability. More than that, you showed genuine understanding of the ecosystem and respect for the life within it. She turned to address the entire assembly. I owe Jake and humanity an apology. We underestimated your species because we did not understand your origins. Jake comes from Earth, a Class 12 Deathworld where survival required constant adaptation. What we designed as an extreme test was, for him, a familiar challenge. The crowd was silent now. Absorbing this information, Professor Dralix gestured to Jake. Would you like to say anything? Jake stepped to the podium, his expression humble. I want to thank the Academy for this opportunity. Every species here has unique strengths. Humans are not superior, just different. We evolved to be adaptable because Earth did not allow us to specialize. My classmates have advantages I will never possess. He gestured to Krelvin. Your people have strength that I cannot match. He looked at Vera. Your species has multitasking abilities that amaze me. We all have something to offer, and we all have something to learn from each other. The simplicity and sincerity of his words resonated through the assembly. Krelvin stood and approached Jake. I underestimated you, and I was wrong. Will you teach me some of your survival techniques? Vera followed. Your approach to problem solving is fascinating. I would like to study your methods. Other students gathered around Jake, their earlier dismissal replaced with genuine respect and curiosity. Professor Dralix watched the scene with satisfaction. The test had accomplished something beyond evaluation. It had taught the entire Academy a valuable lesson about assumptions and understanding. As the ceremony ended and students dispersed, Jake returned to his dormitory. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook. On the final page, he wrote a message he planned to send to his father. Dad, I used everything you taught me. Thank you for preparing me for a galaxy that I am still learning to understand. He looked out his window at the stars beyond Earth. Was out there somewhere among those countless lights a small, dangerous world that had forged humanity in conditions that would terrify most species. Jake smiled, thinking about home.